Hello again, and welcome to this week's episode of Gardening with 4-H. My name is Kelly Cody Brookins, and I'm the 4-H agent here in Columbia County, Georgia. And boy, don't we have an exciting episode for you this week. This week, we're going to get you started in your garden. We'll be talking a little bit about how to select the proper location for your garden if you don't already have one. We'll also walk you through how to build a simple raised garden bed, as well as the tools you'll need to work in that garden. At the end, we'll also talk a little bit about prepping your garden and how to remove weeds before you start planting in your garden. Site selection is key when choosing a location for your garden. There are several factors you'll want to consider before deciding to plant your garden or to build a raised bed. The first thing you'll want to consider is how close your garden is to either your house or the garden shed you'll primarily be gardening from. You want to have easy access to a building for several reasons. You always have those inevitable trips back inside for forgotten supplies or for bathroom breaks. Also, you may want an area to take cover in case your gardening and bad weather comes through. The next thing you'll want to think about is sun and shade. Different plants thrive in various different conditions. A location that offers both sunny and shady areas will provide for these diverse needs. Remember, vegetable plants need a full 6 to 8 hours of sun each day. It is also best to plant your garden going north to south. This way, your garden has the most sunlight possible throughout the day, as the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. Having a nearby reliable water source is essential to proper gardening. You'll want to make sure that you have easy access to a water source like a gardening hose so that you're not having to travel back and forth with big, heavy buckets of water. Lastly, you'll want to choose a location for your garden that has loose, well-drained soil. You'll want to choose a spot where the water drains well after it rains. Constantly wet or waterlogged soil will drown the roots of your plants and may even cause them to rot. You can greatly improve the water drainage and air movement in the soil of your garden by using a raised bed that is enclosed by timber edging. This helps to regulate how much water goes into your raised bed as well as where it goes. If you choose not to use a raised bed, that's okay. You can plant directly into the ground. Just make sure you're choosing an area that is flat and has decent soil to begin with. You will probably have to use amendments to your soil to make sure that you have well-drained soil throughout your garden bed. Also make sure that you choose an area for your garden that's flat and does not have any significant elevation changes. This will cause the water to drain to one side of your garden. This could leave one side of your garden dry as a bone and the other side waterlogged. You can help choose the best site location for your garden by using the Home Sweet Home handout sent earlier this week in an email. Here you can plan out 3 different site locations along with specific criteria. You can rate them through a checkoff list to determine which of the 3 sites would be best to plant your garden. There are several types of tools and equipment you will need to properly prepare your garden as well as to maintain it. First, you'll want a water hose that connects to your water source as well as a spraying attachment. You may also want to purchase a small and large watering can so that you can water those hard-to-reach places. Next, you'll need a rake and a shovel. This will help you to dig holes as well as to properly mix in your soil. You'll need a hoe to help sow your seeds and to help you weed, as well as several hand trowels to plant your seeds and relocate plants if needed. If you have both adults and children working in your garden, you'll want to make sure that you have these tools in a variety of sizes. Regular sized tools are great for adults, but you may want to purchase smaller versions of these tools for children. These tools are more apt for smaller hands to be working in the garden. They also tend to be a little bit safer. Just make sure you're not buying toys. You want to make sure that these are just smaller versions of regular size gardening tools. You'll also want a good pair of pruning shears, as well as a pair of well-fitting, durable gardening gloves. This will help protect your hands from thorns and dirt when you garden. Some other items you may want to purchase include a gardening apron or smock to help prevent mud and dirt from staining your clothes, a wide brim hat to protect your head from the sun, as well as sunscreen to protect your skin. You'll also want a comfortable pair of shoes that you don't mind getting wet or dirty. I personally like to wear my Crocs. They are comfortable to wear for long periods of time and are also waterproof. This makes them very easy to clean with the hose once I'm done gardening for the day. Lastly, you may want to consider purchasing a foam kneeling mat. This is helpful when you have to be on your knees for long periods of time in your garden while planting or weeding. Next, I'm going to walk you through how to build your very own raised garden bed. We will talk about two different sizes, a 3x7 foot gardening form as well as a 4x4 gardening form. Which one you choose largely depends on the area of space you have to plant your garden. Ideally, you want to be able to plant at least 6 types of vegetables in your garden. You also want to make sure that your garden is not too wide. You should be able to reach in the middle of your garden from each side of the bed. If your garden bed is too wide, this may cause you to have to step into your garden to reach the middle of your bed. This could cause you to trample on the plants that you have in your bed. Here are the materials you will need to create a 3x7 foot raised garden bed. A 3x7 foot garden bed will give you 21 square feet of space to plant your garden. You can calculate square feet by simply multiplying the width times the height of your garden. So, 3 times 7 is 21. First, you'll need 2 10-foot boards of untreated lumber. This lumber should be 2 inches thick by 12 inches wide. You can purchase this wood at any kind of home improvement store, such as Lowe's or Home Depot. If you ask the store personnel politely, they may even be able to cut each of the boards into the 2 sections you'll need of 3 feet and 7 feet. Next, you'll need 12 exterior wood screws that are 4 inches long. And lastly, you'll need 10 bags of gardening soil. Each bag has 2 cubic feet of soil in it. So 2 cubic feet times 10 equals a total of 20 cubic feet of soil. Some brands of bagged gardening soil are made to be mixed with equal amounts of bagged topsoil. Be sure to read the instructions on your garden soil bag carefully. If this is the case, you will need to mix 10 cubic feet of gardening soil with 10 cubic feet of topsoil into your garden bed. If you prefer to make a smaller 4x4 foot raised garden bed, you'll need 2 8-foot untreated boards of lumber, 2 inches by 12 inches. Each one of the 8-foot boards will need to be cut in the middle into 2 4-foot sections. Again, if you go to a traditional home improvement store, they can cut the wood right there for you. You'll also need 12 exterior wood screws that are each 4 inches long. Lastly, you'll need roughly 8 bags of garden soil. So that's 8 bags that have 2 cubic feet of soil in each bag for a total of 16 cubic feet of soil. Constructing your raised bed is easy. First, position the boards on their sides to form the garden perimeter. If you are creating a 4x4 garden bed, your perimeter will be square. If you are building a 3x7 garden, your perimeter will be rectangular. Make sure that the long 7-foot boards are running north to south and that the 3-foot boards are running east to west. This will help ensure that your garden has the most amount of sun during the day. Next, have an adult drill pilot holes 1 corner at a time and screw a 4-inch screw into each hole as shown in this diagram. It's a good idea to start with 1 middle screw at each corner. Then the adult can come back around to each corner to add screws at the top and bottom of each board. Do this and voila, you have your simple raised garden bed. There are many variations of a raised garden bed. This is the easiest and simplest one to build. If you look closely at the 2 raised beds we have in our 4-H garden at the office, you'll notice that ours are a little bit taller and have wiring as well as little doors that lock and unlock. These doors help us be able to reach into the bed easily because it is a bit taller. These beds were built this way to help keep animals out of the garden. Animals often like to come to the garden, especially vegetable gardens, to have a little snack. Depending on how tall the plants are growing in your raised garden bed, you may want to place a removable mesh wiring over the top of your raised bed as well. This is helpful if you have an abundance of animals like deer that can easily get into a garden or animals that fly like chickens. Once you have found the perfect location for your newly constructed raised bed, you'll want to properly prepare the ground. You'll need to get rid of grass or weeds that are already growing where your garden will be placed. We will talk about this more specifically later on in the video. After you have prepared the ground, you'll next want to add the soil into your garden bed. Line the bags of soil around the garden frame. Then ask an adult to use scissors to cut open the tops of each bag. Then you want to lift up the bottom of the bags and empty the soil into the garden frame. If you're using both garden soil and topsoil, you'll need to use shovels to mix the soil together as it is being added into the bed. Once the soil is in place, you'll then use hand tools to carefully smooth and pat the soil. Don't pack the soil too tight at the top. Before you can start planting seeds in your garden, you'll first want to plan out or design your garden with paper and a pencil. Several factors come into play when choosing which seeds to plant in your garden, as well as where to plant them. How many growing seasons you'll be able to have in your garden largely depends on the climate you live in. Here in Georgia, we get warmer more quickly in the spring, and we stay warmer longer in the fall. This allows us to have 3 full growing seasons in most parts of Georgia. These 3 growing seasons include an early spring garden, which could be planted in February, a late spring, early summer garden, as well as a fall garden, which can be planted in September or October. The vegetables you plant in your early spring garden as well as your fall garden are called cool weather crops. These crops include vegetables such as carrots, spinach, leaf lettuce, broccoli, cauliflower, and chard. When you plant in the late spring and early summer, you'll want to plant warm weather crops such as bell peppers, tomatoes, and bok choy, as well as squash and zucchini. These vegetables thrive in the heat. The University of Georgia Extension Service provides some wonderful resources to help you determine which vegetables to plant and when. There is a vegetable planting chart available as well as a detailed vegetable gardening calendar. I will send out these PDFs next week in my weekly email. We will focus more on what vegetables to plant in our garden and when to plant them in our next episode. In the meantime, I challenge you to go ahead and plan out 2 different growing seasons for your garden, a cool season crop as well as a warm season crop. In this week's email sent on Tuesday, I attached 2 different grids to help you do this. First, fill out all of the information located on the handout. Then you can begin planting your garden. Each one of the squares on the grid represents a 1 square foot area for your garden. You want to make sure you're using the right amount of space for the garden. If you are plotting out a 4 by 4 foot garden, you would use 16 of the squares on the graph. 4 down and 4 going across. Remember, we calculate square feet by width times height. So 4 times 4 equals 16, meaning you will use 16 of the squares on your graph. And each square, you'll want to plan out which type of vegetable you'll be planting. You'll want to do one graft for warm season crops and then another graft for cool season crops. So our raised beds here at the 4-H office are already built, but they aren't quite ready for planting yet. Our garden beds have not been touched since they were built earlier this year, which means they have a ton of weeds in them. We will not be able to prep properly for our gardens until we're able to get rid of these weeds. So what is a weed? The definition of a weed is any plant that is growing in an undesired location. We often associate certain plants as being weeds, such as thistle and crabgrass. However, any plant can be a weed, even a beautiful flower. A weed is any plant that is growing in an undesired location. So literally, any plant could be considered a weed if it's somewhere you don't want it to be. And weeds compete with your garden plants for things like nutrients, water, light, and air. They can also harbor pests and harmful diseases that can be transferred to the plants in your garden, causing other issues in the future. So this is why it's very important that we weed our gardens weekly during the growing season. And you can weed several different ways. You can either weed by hand using gloves like these, you can use a hoe to dig up the unwanted plants, or even just a simple tool like this. And you may have heard the phrase before, 1 year of seeding means 7 years of weeding. And that's because if weeds are left too long, they begin to produce and drop hundreds, if not thousands of seeds. And once these little tiny seeds get into your soil, they are very hard to get rid of. And some seeds from common weeds can even stay in your soil for years, meaning that it's very difficult for them to go away. It is also important to know what kind of weeds you have in your garden. You want to know if they're annuals or if they are a perennial. And this will determine the best method of getting rid of those weeds. An annual is a plant that lives only for one growing season and then dies back permanently. An example of an annual weed is a chickweed. And the best way to get rid of an annual weed is to pull it completely from the ground, including the roots, and make sure you do it well before that plant flowers and goes to seed. And you can add these annual weeds you pull from your garden into your compost pile if you have one. Just make sure they have not gone to seed yet, because that could potentially spread that weed again into your garden when you use that compost soil. A perennial, on the other hand, is a plant that comes back over several growing seasons. And generally the top portion of that plant dies back in the wintertime and it looks like it's dead, and then it regrows the following spring from that same deep root system. An example of a common perennial weed is a dandelion, and the best way to get rid of a perennial weed is to catch it while they are still young. They are much harder to get rid of once they are established, because those root systems often run very deep and spread really wide, because that's how that plant comes back year after year. And you want to pull these up when the soil is dry, and you can use a hoe or a shovel to dislodge the root system from the ground. And you can actually just pull them out and leave them on the soil surface. They'll eventually shrivel up and die, but you never want to put the remains of your perennial weeds back in your compost bin where they're buried, because they could potentially spread the weed again into your garden. There are a few other methods you can use to help reduce the amount of weeds in your garden. Once your vegetable crop is well established, you can actually mulch in between each plant. And the mulch will help smother any weeds that are trying to grow, and it also helps improve your garden soil structure over time. And if you have a completely new plot that has a ton of weeds in it, maybe over a larger area, especially if there's some established perennial weeds in there, you may actually just want to cut down on the top layer of growth and cover the area with a black tarp or even cardboard. This helps cut out the light to the ground, inhibiting those weeds from growing and making them die. So you want to make sure, if you do this method, that your material is overlapping and secured tightly to the ground so that the weeds won't creep up around the edges and begin to emerge again. And this material can be left on the ground for up to one full growing season, depending on how bad your weeds are. I often get asked about herbicides. I will say most at-home vegetable gardeners prefer not to use herbicides on their gardens, because they're going to be eating the plants that are in their garden, and they don't want those chemicals on there. And you honestly really don't need an herbicide if you weed regularly and you get to the weeds early. Also, if you have a pollinator garden, you want to make sure you stay away from those herbicides and those pesticides as well, and we will talk about that. our plan for our garden is to have one of our garden beds be a pollinator garden and the other one to be a vegetable garden. And before we can prep our garden and get the soil in there, we have to pull out all of these weeds. And our plan is to next week have all these weeds pulled out and our garden soil prepped. And we'll talk a little bit more about what kind of soil you need in your garden, also proper planting procedures. So your goal this week is, if you don't have a garden, you can follow the directions earlier in the video and you can make your own garden pretty easily. If you already have a garden, you won't need to do that part. But our task for this week is to plan out your very own garden. And I have sent that chart in an email to your parents if you are signed up for our weekly emails. And whether you have a garden or not, I want you to try it. In the video, we talk a little bit about cool weather crops and warm weather crops. And so I want you to plan out 2 different types of gardens, one for cool weather crops and one for warm weather crops. That way, if you have a garden now or maybe you have a garden in the future, you'll know what we need to plant in there. And next week, we'll talk more about what's we're able to plant right now, as well as how to do it and how far to put those seeds into the ground, depending on what you're planting. So we hope you will join us next week for another episode of Gardening with 4-H.